I'm seriously cracking up about this idea that like we're like doing sting operations to catch people.
You like can't control yourself. I love it. This is like the rest of the podcast is just you laughing and us trying to recover. Like, anyway.
Tonight, I knew.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, good night, good day, good whatever it is where you are. We're glad you're listening to us this evening on the Drunken UX Podcast. This is episode 18 of the Drunken UX Podcast, and this evening we have a guest with us, Tatiana Mac, who will be talking about accessibility and inclusive design. To get us started, though, I am one of your hosts. My name is Michael Feenan. You can follow me at Feenan, F-I-E-N-E-N, wherever you want to track me down. I actually have Instagram now. It's mfeenan because somebody else has my name. Yeah.
What?
It's kind of like speaking of Instagram, the podcast has an Instagram now. So you can check us out at Drunken UX Podcast on Instagram. But similarly, somebody already had Drunken UX, and it's disappointing to me because they haven't posted anything. So here's our name sitting there. We're Drunken UX everywhere else, but on Instagram, somebody has squatted down on it, and they haven't posted anything. I'm tempted to send them a message and see if maybe they would give it to me, but we'll see. Anyway, I'm Feenan. I have another host with me. He's on the other microphone.
Hello.
Hi.
This is Aaron Hill.
Hi, Aaron Hill.
I'm your co-host. You can follow me on the Twitters at AaronMHill. No, just at AaronMHill. No.com. Oh, this
long day.
Good start. My laptop broke.
You can follow the show at the other places, like I said, Facebook, Twitter, at /Drunken UX. Check us out. Let us know what you think. Send us ideas. We do real-time overview every week. We talk about news and tutorials and articles in web development. Let us know what you're reading and what you would like other people to know about. You can check that out. Yeah, Aaron, you've had some bad luck today, apparently.
My laptop broke this morning just randomly, and then on top of that, when I went to put my shoes on to go outside, my shoestring broke. So
not exactly on the same scale, but okay, I'll give it to you. Hey,
it's like death by 1,000 minor inconveniences.
But on the bright side, if everybody can hear everything okay, you might notice that we did get Aaron's audio fixed, so he should sound much better this week. So we fixed something. That's got to count, somewhere.
That's a sure, yeah. First world victories, I guess.
Aaron, what do you got over there in your glass this evening?
Oh, I'm taking another shot at the Vesper Martini. I think I got the ratios a little better this time. It doesn't taste completely like alcohol.
I think you're doing it wrong.
So
if it doesn't taste like alcohol.
Well, last time, it tastes like alcohol, but just not complete. Like last time, it tasted like I was drinking rubbing alcohol. Like I didn't have enough Lillet Blanc in it, I think.
That's a tough drink, man. That was a hard night.
I also didn't shake it enough last time, and so not enough of the ice melted, and so it was just like double barrel of
that Everclear.
Yeah,
we're drinkers, not mixologists.
Right.
I'm going to take another shot at it one of these nights, but I do want to actually get a bottle of Lillet Blanc, and I'm headed out of town this weekend where there is a much bigger and well-stocked liquor store. So I might be able to get a bottle, and I think I'll be interested to try it correctly, so to speak. I mentioned on the last episode that I would break out the Tres Mujeres, and so there we go.
You did?
We've got Tres Mujeres.
Excellent.
Nice oak-aged tequila. Sipping, not shooting, not blending. We're going to just enjoy this.
I was at that distillery just last month.
You were?
Mm-hmm.
Is it from up in Portland?
No, tequila. Oh. It was in in Tequila.
Yeah.
Okay.
Down over the border. That's my buddy was traveling and brought me back a bottle of it.
Nice. That was a nice gift.
Well, it wasn't a gift. I paid him to do it.
Nice gift to
gift.
yourself if you let me finish.
So if anybody is wondering, that is the voice of our guest this week. Tatiana Mac is an interactive art designer and director, and she is super passionate about accessibility and inclusive design and universal design and all of these ideas that tend to orbit around each other. And it's something that we've wanted to talk about, but certainly wanted to have a voice who could teach us a few things. So hopefully y'all learned something this evening. Tatiana, thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to come and sit with us on this.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And sorry, I didn't know if I came out of the curtain too soon there. It's supposed to sit silent.
No, it's fine.
Now, one of these days I'll do like a surprise reveal of somebody. We'll start out like a normal show, and then hey, all of a sudden, Eric Myers. I don't know.
Oh my gosh, John Cena.
Oh, John Cena. Yeah, there we go.
I like that. Yeah.
John Cena.
Can you imagine what he has to say about UX?
I would not be completely surprised if he had some insightful comments about it.
Yeah.
I think that he'd be the kind of person to delightfully surprise you about things.
He seems like a sharp fellow. What can I say? And funny. Funny to boot. So like I said, we're going to talk about accessibility. We're going to talk about a lot of these concepts around each other a lot, but I wanted to start things off at the start. So if you go out and you look up tutorials on this stuff, you go sit in at a conference session, whatever, you're going to hear these words, right? You hear accessibility, you hear 508 compliance. In Kansas, it's policy 1210 is the state governing umbrella for that. But then you also have this inclusive design idea, this universal design idea. So let's
A11Y too.
Yeah,
right? Ally.
Shorten them for your hashtags and things like that. I want to start there because I think it's easy to mash these things together, but they are different. They do imply different things. So Tatiana, start with that, if you would. Tell us, what does that mean to you, and what are those differences in principles and philosophy?
Yeah, so I think that the important aspect to focus on here is that these terms definitely matter. And as with words have impact. I think it's important also to not necessarily allow these words to become a harbinger for your initiatives around accessibility, right? So we need to understand these terms and what implications that they have, but also not allow them to become preventative terms to prevent us from going ahead. We're going to make mistakes. I think that's a big caveat that I'll throw out is as with design, accessible design, we're going to be making mistakes. So the sooner we can acknowledge that those mistakes will happen, whether it be with how we use the terms or with our executions of accessibility, we need to kind of accept that empirical truth. But to dive into the terms, so universal design, I'll start there, is the idea that design should be universally usable by any user. So it shouldn't require any adaptations or adjustments. And there is a bit of nuance in this term that I think is important to note, which is that depending on the person designing the tool, universal design is can be very dangerous because you might think something is universally accessible if you have access to using both of your hands dexterously, right? Like it's always going to come from the point of view of the designer creating the tool or the app or whatnot. Whereas accessible design takes a focus on designing for those who have special needs or requirements. So at the center, you're putting folks who don't necessarily have every single tool at their disposal and then designing for that. And I think that nuance is really important to look at because many designers are, able-bodied and bring a lot of that bias to the table. And then, we'll talk more, I think, about design patterns in a bit, but if the design patterns we start to create and start to trend are created by those designers, that becomes the baseline. But that baseline has been created with an ableist bias. And I think that's why it's so important to focus on accessible design, which forces the designer to step back and to assess the full gamut of their users and design for the users with the most needs. Because for folks who don't have those needs, the design is just going to be even easier for them to use, right? Like if it's something that you make accessible for one hand, for example, folks with two hands, it's just going to be easier, or it's going to allow them to do the same thing with one hand and they can do whatever they want with the other hand, or not even have to consider it.
I have a example I give people for this, because I try to get these two things broken apart a little bit so that people understand what it means. And the example I tend to give is like language barrier stuff, because language accessibility is not about not having or having a disability or an ability somebody else doesn't or anything like that, but it can be an access problem and a usability problem if 20% of your users are from Mexico, but you don't offer Spanish language translations. You are not thinking about the needs of those users from a very base level. And it's not because, of anything except for a generalized barrier and like, Quebec and the way they have approached that and basically made a requirement of you have to offer things in English and French because they didn't want people just throwing one of those languages out the window because it was too much work to implement, for instance. That's one way I think about it.
So, one of the things that Donald Norman talks about in Design of Everyday Things is idea of affordances. Like if you have when a user is approaching a new system that requires some amount of learning, you provide affordances like on a stove. If you have 4 knobs, you put the knobs in an arrangement that correlates each knob to a particular burner, so you can like kind of onboard to it more easily. So Tatiana, when you talk about accessible design, are you talking kind of about sort of making affordances for users that are differently abled?
I think that absolutely that makes sense.
Okay.
To think of it in that way. I also think that it's about designing it to be as simple as possible. And I think that that's a principle. I don't think accessible design is very widely taught in formal design schools. And it's not something that our community does, outside of the accessibility community, does a great job of taking into consideration. So I think that it's important to tether the idea of accessibility to something that is very intuitive and widely talked about in design, which is, I think, like that idea of keeping your design as simple as possible. And I think that's where designs tend to become inaccessible, is that we pack on features, we pack on interactions, and it's all to make the design more special. But often in doing so, we're removing layers and layers of accessibility.
So in your Skillshare, which will have a link in the doobly-doo, you talk about design systems. Can you explain what that is versus design? And like we've talked about design philosophies before and how those are different than just design. What is a design system?
So a design system is effectively looking at designs not through the lens of comps. I think that most designers who have been working in web for a while have gotten used to this idea of creating comps for their developers, right? Like you're trying to create every single possible instance of every single interaction so that your developer can create all of those instances. But a design system is stepping back and looking at it as a suite. You're going to have things like buttons, you're going to have form fields, you're going to have image treatments, type stacks. So instead of looking at it through the content as it exists now, it's saying, we know what types of content we're going to have. Let's create all of those components, and then let's create a system or language around that idea. And I also feel like we have to admit a bit that that is a practice that has been happening in design in the past, right? Like those things have existed pre-web, but it's having its rebirth. We love trendy words. So, if we Google design systems right now, there's a lot of articles being written by very smart design systems designers. But I think that's where accessibility and design systems can become really healthily tethered together, because if your design system is baked to being accessible, that removes likely many errors that you might make in making inaccessible designs, because the components you're drawing from are already accessible to begin with.
So I guess like the episode with Greg Podanovich where we talked about design philosophies, he was sort of saying that like the design philosophy is kind of the spirit or the essence of what your brand is expressed through design. So a design system might be sort of a predetermined discussion about the implementation strategies for how that will influence design. Does that sound right?
I like that. I think that your design system should be influenced by a design philosophy. And as an accessibility supporter, I would say that accessibility should be a fundamental ethic or ethos integrated into your philosophy that guides your design system.
Okay, gotcha. So when you're making a style guide, how, like, at what point of the process do you kind of integrate the design system into the style guide and vice versa?
So I think that one of the first steps before integrating it into the style guide is making sure you have the conversation with your team. I think that that's something that gets neglected often, is that accessibility can't be just like, any other social cause, can't be championed by one person and one person alone. Because the idea of a design system is relinquishing a lot of that individualistic control that designers have historically liked to have. You're basically saying, here's the language, now everyone go speak it. I hope you speak it like I do. And that's scary for a lot of designers who like to control the design. But I think that if you have the conversation with folks and get people understanding the impact of accessibility and getting them to think about accessibility in a different way, your design system will have more voices championing this idea. So I think that's just a note that I like to make, is that accessibility has to be bought in by more than just one person.
Okay.
There comes a point too where I think, and I've talked to people that have struggled with this. I've seen presentations that have gone into this idea that we tend to focus on accessibility so much as an afterthought that people feel like it's bolted on, because it is in many cases. And when you talk about integrating it with, the underpinnings of whatever system or philosophy that you have, it tends to be looked at as something of a burden to, I already have my stuff. Now you want me to throw all this other, consideration into the mix. And the thing I get at by saying all of that is, there was a time where we did not put elevators in tall buildings. Now, if you build a tall building, there are a lot of reasons the elevator is there, but now it is just assumed. You build a building, you're putting an elevator in it. And that's where I hope to see this discussion going in the coming years, is we stop talking about it like it's something you have to do. And we're going to talk here in a second about why we suck at this. And one of the reasons we suck at it is because accessibility gets looked at as this list of checkboxes that you have to get through. And so eventually we will overcome that feeling. And it will just be part of the way you do it.
I've heard that same idea of the checkboxes list, like for compliance in the InfoSec circles, where a lot of like the C-suite or the higher ups will often just say like, does our security, like pen testing, does it get a green check mark on all these different items? And sometimes that still overlooks like some bigger security vulnerabilities, but they've hit their checkboxes, so they're like, we're good.
Yep. And because that's just how business is geared, right? Business is set on lists of actionable things. And is it done or not done? And that's true in, with accounting. It's, it's true with HR. It's not just a web focused issue, that checkbox thing. But I do think it is particularly hindering to us because so much of what we do is qualitative, not quantitative. It's easy to be like, well, has HR done all their exit interviews? Have they, asked about these things? Is payroll taking care of X, Y, and Z? Either it is or it isn't in a lot of those cases. But with design, there's a lot of subjective stuff that happens. There's a lot of qualitative stuff that happens. And there's a lot of stuff that moves constantly. You design something with, a opacity, turned down background image with white text over it. You've designed it with color
Did you say
hey, tequila, man.
There's such authority, though, where I was questioning whether it was a word. I was like, it sounds like a word, I guess.
You don't have to be smart if you say it with authority. Rule number 1 of conference presenting. But it's that idea that we can design it perfectly and then hand it off to a content person who figures out 12 different ways to break it. And so you've got to constantly be checking and reviewing, and it is a cycle. It is a process. It is not a goal. It is not a finish line to cross.
So that said, Tatiana, have you worked with organizations that have had to kind of revisit how they integrate accessibility into their practices? Like what are some ways that you've been able to kind of influence that?
Yeah, I think that the sad part is it's not that I'm coming in and helping them to improve their accessibility processes. It's that I'm coming in and I'm asking, oh, well, how does this consider, accessible design, or how will this be accessible to folks who have neurological disorders? And there's silence. And I think that's the scariest part. So going back to your idea of elevators, it's like I'm the magician that comes and I'm like, I have this magical thing. It's called an elevator. And everyone's like, she's a witch.
It's a box.
Right. They're like, it's a box that moves on its own. She's a witch. And so I think that that's the scarier part right now, is that we live in this society where we like to think that, we're quote unquote civilized. But this is a very somewhat baseline thing that I think all designers should be considering, and it's not very widely considered.
It seems almost like accessibility and things that are accessibility adjacent are almost regarded with kind of a hostility by people who don't care about them at all, in the same way that like you might have like a preschool classroom and like one person is clearly like bothering the person next to them, but they're like, I'm not hitting them, like I'm not putting glue in their hair anymore. Like what's the problem here?
Right.
Like, we're not like there's not enough empathy. There's just like, look, I'm doing the thing you told me to do. Like why is this a problem?
Yeah, I think that, and we won't get into social justice as a topic because that's an entire different podcast and an entire different episode. But I do think that there is a common thread that I do want to identify. And I do talk about this a little bit in my Skillshare class, is that the inherent privilege that we all proceed with as designers and developers. And we talked a little bit about this earlier. I think that it's really hard for us to suspend our experiences. It's not impossible, but we're not asked to do it very often when we're in the majority, because that's what privilege is. If we were able to know we were privileged, we would be so much farther along in the world. But that's the kind of the challenge inherent to privilege, is that we don't realize how hard things can be for other people until we see them ourselves, we hear about them ourselves, or we experience them ourselves.
Right.
And I think that that's kind of a good segue into a quality of disability, or a temporal aspect of disability, which is that at some point in our lives, we experience disabilities, even if they're not permanent to us. And that's a common breakdown with when you're looking at disabilities is to look at it on the time scale. Like most folks who are experiencing this that we're designing for have a permanent disability, right? Like they have they're colorblind forever. But it could be the case that you had maybe your city is shrouded in smoke because of fires, and you are experiencing
like your city is literally on fire.
Yeah, exactly. As a random example, and you might experience some vision impairment. Well, one would hope that that's not going to become permanent, but that's a temporary blindness that I experienced. Or I looked into the sun during the eclipse, and maybe for the rest of that day, I couldn't see. That's also temporary.
Yeah.
So the 3 ways that we break that down are permanent, temporary, and then situational. And you'll see a common example of this is for having access to only one arm. So permanent is if you're an amputee. Temporary is, let's say you broke your arm. And then situational is you're holding a bag of groceries or a baby or your pet fox, and you only have access to one arm.
The other interesting thing about this idea of being, the temporarily abled, or however, whatever phrase people want to use for this, is we don't stop to think quite enough, I think, about the fact that we have not been building websites very long. I am still very just lightly middle-aged, we'll say kindly to me. The aging of our society, the folks who are entering their 60s and 70s and 80s now are not necessarily people that have needs that are web-based, or simply haven't interacted with that medium to this day. It's going to be another 30 years before I advance to that point in my life. And, many of my friends and colleagues that are in their late 30s, early 40s, who are, have been doing this for, as long or longer than me, they're sort of the leading edge of that wave. And I think that that's going to be a huge turning point for the way we think about that, because now you're going to have all of these Gen Xers, all these early millennials who did have all of this stuff and expect to have all of this stuff, and are finally, that light bulb is going to go off. They may not see the light bulb anymore, but it's going to go off. And they're going to realize, oh, this is what they meant. This is what everybody was talking about when they said, you know what, someday you're going to know.
Yeah, I think that a common thing I like to do is to compare our world and our timeline to other types of design. So I'm a huge pyramid fan and Egyptology fan. So I like to look at pyramids and how they've progressed over time. I'll never forget the first time that I went to the Red Pyramid in Cairo, which is not very well known. But it's fascinating to look at that pyramid and then to look at the Great Pyramids and to see the evolution that happened. There was this like sense of insecurity. The Red Pyramid has a really, really, really large base. And if you look it up, it looks ridiculous compared to what we know pyramids to look like now. But you can see the thought process. It's like, well, we don't know, like, this is probably going to come collapsing down. We're pretty sure there's this force that's pulling things to the ground. Let's make this base real large to make sure that all this work we're putting into this isn't going to collapse. And then,
looks like a squashed pyramid.
Yeah, it's
like
really
semi-flat.
Yeah, it's really huge on the bottom.
Huh.
And so I like to think about websites that way, right? Like we were like, oh, well, everyone uses a desktop because back then they did. And we're like, let's slice it into 1 million cells in a table. And that was kind of our initial pyramid. And we have to work so hard to undo some of those early decisions because we look at design, I think, through the first lens. And that's, I think, my cautionary tale is that we have to step back and not just look at what's the first lens are we looking through, but who's the person writing that story and what privilege does that designer bring to the table that we're inherently progressing forward with.
Right.
So I want to talk here before we go to break. Let's look at this through maybe a more tactical lens in terms of why we suck at this. And Tatiana, you started kind of getting on that with your pyramid metaphor, and I was talking about the checkboxes thing. That there are, I think, I mean, people are probably going to write dissertations in the future about why we were so bad at this, at this point in time. But there are, I think, some very specific reasons why we aren't being effective, or as effective as it could be, certainly. One is this idea that, I tend to think of accessibility not in a philosophical sense. And I know a lot of people don't do that, because for us, accessibility exists as 508 compliance. And that goes back to that checkbox mentality. And technical people, I think, very much think that way. They don't think qualitatively. They think 1 or 0. I did it or I didn't do it. And where this really failed us, I think, very specifically, is with the WCAG specs. And as those didn't evolve, we just saw 2.1, we just saw that come out, and it's got all these updates for newer systems and web applications and state changes and devices and all of this stuff, and that's great. That's fantastic. And then it's going to get old again. And what we do a really bad job of is looking at these things and extracting the intent out of some of them. One of the, and I can already predict it. In WCAG 2.1, they have a new spec on hit size. So if you've got something that needs to be clickable, it has a minimum hitbox size. I think it's 44 pixels by 44 pixels. That is a very specific and screen-dependent measurement that could change very rapidly in terms of the device you're using, the environment you're using something in. And instead of people sitting down and saying, yeah, 44 pixels isn't big enough anymore, that idea, people are going to sit down and they're going to say, yeah, but it's 44 pixels, so it's good enough. It satisfies the requirement. They aren't going to sit there and think about, let's maybe understand that they did this because we need to make sure something is big enough to interact with. And 6 years from now, if Project Silver hasn't landed yet or something like that, we're going to be able, a good designer is going to sit there and say, we need it to be bigger, and it should just be bigger because that's the point. And then you're going to have all the people saying, yeah, but 44 pixels is the check mark. That's something we got to get over.
It sounds like you're talking a little bit about persona-based design, like integrating an accessible persona, or accessible, I'm not using the right words, a persona that would require accessibility.
But that's the problem. I'm going to challenge that really quickly. I think the problem is to consider that accessibility is affecting one of your personas. I would make the argument that accessibility affects all of the personas. It's just that when you're talking about an accessibility persona, you're talking about someone who it affects to a degree of awareness, where they're hyper aware as to how their experiences are compromised because they are faced with inaccessible design. We all have accessibility considerations that we would take. Speaking for myself, I was one of the first champions at a lot of the places I worked for doing size 20 pixel baseline font. And I still get pushback from people, usually people that are have fresher eyes than I do, telling me that's insanely large. They're like, that's so big. Why would you make it that large? And now I look at them and if you look at most websites, blogging websites, that is the baseline. So I guess I challenge that idea, and I challenge that practice of integrating your accessibility considerations into only one persona. I think they should be integrated into every single one.
Do you think it'd be more like a trait that could be considered for each persona, kind of layered on top of, this is the persona and these are the desires, tasks, etc., that they would be approaching the site with? And then these are the different flavors of that persona, they have different capabilities as far as interacting with the site.
Exactly.
You mean more like that?
Yeah, exactly. I think if we look at the statistics around accessibility, it's often cited as being 15% of folks. But I think that that's one, it's a higher number than most people realize. But two, I also think that it's not considering, that's considering to the degree I mentioned earlier. I think that we all are benefited, or we all benefit from accessible design. So yes, to integrate all the different types in each of your personas would be excellent, because I think that there's also, even within accessibility, a bias for physical disabilities, because it's something we can see. We can see someone with one arm, we can see someone who's vision impaired, but then there's a whole host of disorders that happen internally that are, neurological or psychological, that affect the way in which people view the web. And so I'm just of the belief that 15% is shy of what it actually affects. And
this would kind of get back to the design system thing that you talked about earlier, where it would be sort of an underlying foundation that you would then consider, that would then affect implicitly all of these different personas.
Exactly. I think that it would also help to mitigate that bias for visibly physical disabilities.
And I think there's a good reason why, from a design and certainly a developer standpoint, we tend to bias our thought process that way. And it comes down to testability, right? It's easy for me to, easy relative term, but it's easy for me to test, being blind. It's easy for me to test being deaf. Those as a qualitative feature of how something works, those are systems for which we can create a way, to go in there and see how that turns out. As we go down that rabbit hole, it starts to get hard for people. And I'm not saying this as like a defense of the thinking. I'm just saying this is why people think this way. I think that when you get into not even like to like the cognitive level or things like that, like I've never seen a persona that included as a trait of the person colorblindness, for instance. And I think colorblindness isn't even that rare. Like it affects, what is it, like 10% of all males, something like that. And we have tools to simulate it quite easily. And yet we don't ever seem to include a trait like that in one of our testable personas. Because, it comes down to, it comes down to so many things, but I do absolutely agree with what you're saying, Tatiana, that we shouldn't make a persona that is like, particularly like just the catch-all. Like it's
just the one person who is, it's basically, it's Helen Keller using your site.
Right, yeah, that is not the solution.
Yeah. Right, yeah. I think that's a really good point. And it is fascinating to me because color blindness does affect, I think it's like 8% of men. So that's basically, almost 1 in every 10 dudes that are colorblind. And then I also consider that a lot of those dudes that I've met don't actually know that. And I get to reveal to them. Yeah, I get to reveal to them when they're wearing 2 colors that don't make sense together. I've been that person to many people. So I think that's an aspect of it, is that color blindness certainly has its ramifications. But perhaps because it's something that even folks who have it sometimes aren't aware of it, it helps to lead to not considering it.
Well, let's all run away for about 60 seconds. We're going to go refill our glasses, regroup on all the things, and then we're going to come back and we're going to start talking about how we can take some of this stuff and these ideas about why we're not very good at it, and how we start integrating this into our work so that from the ground up, you are building things that take people in mind and put people ahead of code, basically. So sit tight. We'll be back. And have fun. The Drunken UX Podcast is brought to you by our friends at NewCloud. Are you trying to build a case around an interactive map for your school, city, or business? NewCloud's interactive map platform gives you the power to make and edit a custom interactive map in just minutes. Their team of professional cartographers specialize in map illustrations and are ready to design a rendering to fit your exact needs. One map serves all your users' devices with responsive maps that scale and blend in seamlessly with your website. Visit them online to request a demo at nucloud.com/drunkenux. That's nucloud.com/drunkenux. Thanks for sticking with us here on the Drunken UX Podcast. We are talking to Tatiana Mac this evening about accessibility and inclusive design and all of those beautiful things that make your websites better for all of the people. I've switched my drink of choice here. I've actually gone to a cherry Pepsi and Kraken.
How many
never...
how many tentacles of Kraken you got in there?
Well, about 2.
That's about what I do.
Pretty normal. I've never actually mixed these 2 in particular, so I'm curious to see what happens there. And Tatiana, while we were on our little break, I did take a second just to check. I thought it was okay, and I wanted to make sure that you will be happy to know that on my personal blog site, I am using 20-point font. That is my base font. I didn't check the Drunken UX site, but I'm pretty sure we are there too. And if we aren't, I will make a commitment to you right here. I will make sure that we change that. And I'm checking it right now, actually, as I'm looking here. So a font size is... Oh, yeah, no, it's... Wait. I made it smaller. I've been doing a lot of mobile testing, and so my thing automatically went to mobile view. No, we are 18, so I make a commitment to up that to 20, so...
I just wanted to check my blog, and my blog has an error establishing database connections, so today just got better.
You are learning accessibility 101 there. You can't be broken if you can't get to it.
But his site isn't accessible at all, so that's the height. Yeah. That's pinnacle inaccessible right there.
It's the roll safe guy. It's like you can't have an inaccessible site if your site is completely inaccessible.
Yeah, it's Schrodinger's principle of accessibility.
I like it. So we're going to talk this half of the show about how we get better, how we talk about this both, at a somewhat tactical level with individual things, but also thinking about it from a work standpoint, and how we talk about this to coworkers or teams, or, when you go, work for a company, if you're a freelancer, contractor, or something like that. We want to teach you guys. So the first thing I've got on my notes, and I figure the start of the start is the best place to start, is with integrating. Holy crap. Integrating this into your processes. And the first question is, how do you identify need? And I think maybe the corollary to that question is basically, how do you make sure that you are being inclusive? How do you make sure that you are accounting for things that you maybe don't even know about? To put a stupid example out there, maybe you don't know color blindness is a thing. So how do you, open yourselves up to that? Analytics doesn't tell you that, right? Analytics doesn't tell you if somebody's colorblind. User testing. That's the best answer I have.
Yeah.
What about you guys?
I think user testing and casting a wider net is certainly one answer. I think that often, from my experience with user testing, and granted I haven't worked places where there was super extensive user testing, so maybe you all can chime in on that regard, but I think that there is a common practice with user testing where people just bring in people they know. And turns out people's friend circles are not that diverse. So I think that being able to cast a wider net and including more folks across the gamut is one component. But I would even argue that that's a bit too late, because at that point you're testing something that possibly was designed without any accessibility in mind. So you're going to have to do one of two things. You're either going to kind of have to start over, or you're going to be shoehorning different things in just to pass an arbitrary set of criteria. You have to
get over that idea of if it isn't happening in my circle, it must not be happening. And I see that.
Sorry.
No, because that goes, and I think I know exactly why you're laughing. Is because it's not an accessibility thing. Like that is just the way people think. Whether it's about news, whether it's about business, whether it's about any number of things, we tend to discount something if we don't happen to know somebody that is affected by that, and we got to get over that. You have to start accepting the fact that things happen outside of your sphere of influence. And you need to be open to talking to those people and figuring out how to include them, to use a word.
Maybe we could call it inclusivity or inclusiveness.
Inclusiveness?
Yeah. Would that work? Seems like a good
Inclusion.
word.
Yeah, I mean, inclusive design is certainly another term that gets used. And I think that's important because it also, I think that, like I said earlier, accessible design tends to have a physical disability bias, and what it neglects that inclusive design, I think, implies is including, like, people don't often think about the considerations with nationality, race, and language as being inaccessible. I think you mentioned this earlier, is that we just don't think of that as access. And so I think when we use accessible design, that kind of pigeonholes us into only thinking about physical, sometimes neurological disabilities. But when we talk about inclusive design, that starts to force us to think about things like race, and access to fast internet is another one. And gender, and so many other things that definitely influence our experiences. They don't necessarily render them useless always, but they have impact and they have an influence on the emotion behind our experiences, which I think is important to note. So I guess that's why I always say that I'm a champion for accessible and inclusive design.
The fast internet thing is kind of funny because the last episode, Michael and I were reviewing weather sites, and what was it, AccuWeather?
Yeah.
Was that the one with all the ads?
Yeah, bad.
Yeah, their site was like tens of megabytes, wasn't it?
Yeah, 60.
Just from ads alone, mainly.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good example of, with speed in particular, is something that, going back to the idea of temporary, situational, and permanent, like, I think we often think about internet speeds being slow in, like, Africa. Like, that's like our go-to example of, like, oh, well, in Africa, the internet's like 2G internet. But I just want to remind everyone and I see them on Twitter, who complains about their slow internet in their house, at work, when they're on a plane, like, and that's such a perfect example of, like, you've literally experienced this, and you experience this on a regular basis. But it's still foreign to people when they're doing site testing. So I would bet that those people who created that weather site have experienced slow sites before, but then they just somehow, like, miraculously forget when they're testing on their fast internet how awful that experience is.
Well, and, to take it back to sort of that privilege discussion just a little bit, that, to us, oh, my internet is slow for now, but it won't be here in a little bit. It's just my line having a hiccup or something, or my ISP having, a lot of people on. But here in a little bit, it'll just be better. But those folks, it doesn't get better.
I read an article a couple days ago about how in the state of Arkansas, it's called digital redlining. And it's like, for example, there's these public services like provided by the state government where the websites themselves are only accessible from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. or something. Like, the website has hours. A website. they don't accept submissions outside of that time frame. I'll put the link for the thing in the doobly-doo. But that, like, it's mind-blowing. But I guess in the state of Arkansas, though, there's internet access is limited and not always high speed.
Arkansas, when you just want worse Kansas. That's what I always say. No, and that was a factor, like, even just thinking about, again, how this affects normal people. When I was looking for a new house, I needed to make sure I had a house that had good internet, because I literally make my livelihood on it. I can't suffer a slow connection because it impedes my ability to work. But access to good internet severely restricted where I could choose to live. I wanted to kind of get outside of town. I wanted to be, in the country. I would have liked to have had a pond because I like fishing. I'm a country boy like that. Not in other ways, but like that. And I couldn't do that because there just wasn't that kind of access. I could have gotten internet, but it wouldn't have been good enough to accomplish what I needed. Now, my needs obviously are significantly more robust than others, but it's, getting that context, I think, helps people start to understand at least a little bit, how important these things are and how it does. The US is in bad shape in terms of speed compared to a lot of places. So let's talk about education real fast here, because I know, of course, we've mentioned several times, Tatiana has a Skillshare on this that we definitely encourage folks to go check out. But and you had mentioned this early on that we aren't doing a good job teaching this stuff, and I'm kind of wondering, I guess, in the back of my head, maybe what that looks like down the road, and how if a kid goes and enrolls in a graphic design course at University X, how do those courses include that, do you think?
Well, I can't speak from experience here because I'm a self-taught designer. So I don't necessarily know whether I don't believe that it is, from people that I've talked to, being widely included in design programs. I think that it's often the case that we look to educational infrastructure as being the solution. I definitely think it is a solution. And I do hope that any design professors and teachers will consider at least one component in accessibility so that there's general awareness. But I think that we need to solve this problem both systematically like that, and also in a very grassroots way where we just start talking about it more. I think, having this podcast and talking about it, I'm headed to Epicurrence, which is a conference in Yosemite next week, and I'll be talking about it there. I just don't think it occurs to a lot of people. And I think wherever you can be that kindling of accessibility and you can ignite that conversation, you have the power to seriously impact the way in which your organization, no matter how small, starts to consider accessible design at a broad scale. And I think that that's where we need to be very careful to not think of solutions as only being systematic, but see the many ways in which us as individuals who work in this industry can impact talking about accessibility more. I think that's like the number one answer I have.
I think too, the way I look at it, and there's almost an irony to this, the way it reads to me is, we make fun a little bit. Let me rephrase. I make fun of educational programs that try to teach web development because they are so frequently, at a state school level, behind. They tend to be always playing catch up. They put students out who are not caught up on, various skills or tools or processes or whatever. And a lot of like graphic design courses and things like that, and design philosophy courses, they'll get into Photoshop, and that's cool. Photoshop's been around forever and it will continue to be around forever. So that's probably reliable. And they will talk about design philosophies from the 30s up, into modern times. And that's cool too. But why aren't we including inclusive design in that? Because inclusive design is the discussion that doesn't age. Like the thought processes and the problem solving skills that go into how to design something that accounts for people. That's not dependent on your tools. Now, getting tools can make it better. Figuring out how to test things and do things like that can certainly improve that process. But we are talking about a principle, a philosophy, a set of ideas that govern the way you think about a problem. And so I think that's one area where, and if anybody listening teaches courses, I know for a fact a couple of you do, because I've talked to you and I know who you are. You guys are the ones who have that chance. And if you're not doing it in your classes, I would definitely encourage that. Or if you're, we've got, for instance, here in Pittsburgh, we've got a technology advisory committee for our high school. And they're always asking us, what does your industry look for? They actually make custom courses for some of these kids. And I try, at one point, they're like, should we be teaching Flash? No, sir. You should not be teaching Flash. And I'm not making that. That is not me trying to be facetious for the microphone. That was literally a question that we got asked about 2 years ago. So just to give you an idea of where they're at. But we try to push these ideas of teach a kid how to do a build process. I don't care what kind, but think about it. Teach a kid how to work with the other kids. And I think teach a kid how to think about a problem inclusively certainly falls within that collection of ideas, because it's a skill that they can carry forward and apply. And so that's kind of what I hope from education.
Yeah, I think that this touches on what is probably a past or potential future topic, which is this idea that I think design is often taught vocationally when it needs to be taught a bit more philosophically. That the permanence in design, and I would argue development, is in understanding, teaching yourself how to think and how to learn, not teaching yourself specific tools. And I think that's kind of the Achilles heel of so many design and development programs, is they are playing catch up. They're teaching students like C++ and like Java. And not to say that those languages aren't being used anymore, but it's so challenging, I think, when I see developers, especially who are young, and they learn React. Like I am a React developer. And it's like, okay, but do you understand how JavaScript works? And I think that that's where like the fundamental understanding isn't there for a lot of newer designers and developers. They just learn the tool. They learn how to use Figma. And it's like, that's great, but do you understand the design philosophy to that? So I do think, like, institutionally, yes, we can have a wide impact, but I also think that for new designers and developers, like taking a bit of priority in teaching yourself through the many wonderful like self-teaching courses you can take, whether it be through Skillshare or Treehouse, there's so many out there, but focusing more attention on those fundamental courses and worrying a bit less about being trained in whatever language, because depending on where you work, you're going to have to learn a new framework anyway. And I would hope that employers, and I think this is where employers can help, is don't hire for the language, hire for the understanding and the process and the intelligence behind the person. You can teach them the language. You can't necessarily or easily teach them how to understand good development or design practices.
Yeah, I have emphasized that more times than I can count, that when I'm hiring, if I'm interviewing people, if I'm looking for folks to help out on anything, I will hire smart people frequently before I hire skilled people, if that makes sense. Like, I need somebody that I know can learn and adapt and pick things up. If you come in already knowing stuff, I know that means I have bad habits that I'm going to have to break in you. Or maybe not bad habits, but certainly, things that you do and are used to doing that don't mesh with, whatever process you're coming into. And that flexibility and that nimbleness is so important to everything from communication to problem solving to designing to building, and solution engineering. Let's see how many other buzzwords I can cram into that. But yeah, I'm totally on.
Yeah, and I'm just going to throw this out there. I feel like skilled people tend to have more egos than smart people. Just going to throw that one out there.
What are you talking about? Wait.
Like someone who identifies themselves based on a specific skill they have, they tend to be very ego driven in my experience.
It could be a consequence of imposter syndrome. Like if you're narrowly trained into a specific skill, like very specific in that skill set, then you might be worried that you'll get found out as not being also being a smart person.
Yeah, and I think part of it too is smart people chase and crave learning. A smart person will continue to learn and grow their skill set, whereas a skilled person, kind of like what you're just saying, they will entrench themselves in their skill. And that's great if you need that particular thing. But outside of that, it gets difficult.
I'm happy to say that my website is back up.
It's accessible again.
Well, I don't know if it's accessible, but it is accessible.
It's accessible.
I mean, it's more accessible than it was like 10 minutes ago.
Yes, that is true.
So let's talk about a couple of these individual ideas. And I think too, what we can do as we go through this is break up how accessibility differs from inclusivity in them. So thinking about type and typography, and we've talked about some of this already, but we'll go through a little bit of it again. We know big font is important. It's easier to read, it's easier to see on a mobile device for certain. I agree with you, Tatiana. I'm a big fan of crank that font size up as high as you can. Are you paying for pixels? What's
Yeah, mine's at 14 pixels.
Fix it.
I'm working on it.
Yeah, and I think too, like that's where I'm going to tie back into design systems, right? That it's not, I mean, would I love every website for my own vision impairness to be size 20? Yes, but my bigger request would be don't make your site break when I use an inherent feature of the browser to zoom in. And that happens a lot with designs that are so, and I think this is a term from the grave a bit, but pixel perfect, that when I increase the font, it breaks your container because you only wanted me to view it in that one way. You're a controlling designer that decided that I should only see this in one size and one size alone. So I think allowing that fluidity within your design is a core principle of accessible design, knowing that folks are going to be making adjustments, right? So they're going to be adjusting the size. Often they're going to be adjusting the contrast. They're going to be reducing motion. Like I think a lot of designers could benefit from knowing how much power or how little power, depending on how you look at it, users can affect the design of their sites.
Yeah, there's, this idea of, and we talk about it in marketing quite a bit, about who owns your brand, so to speak. You may own your trademarks, but the brand is sort of a piece of the perception that everybody has of you. And if their perception is one thing, that's, you can try to manipulate it, but you can't take away their ability to perceive you one way or another. And the same goes for, this way you approach design, that once your design is out there and it's in the browser, you may own the code, you may own those Photoshop files or Illustrator files or whatever, but the person now controls the way it makes them feel and the way that they use it. And if that means they are cranking the zoom level up, if that means they are splitting their screen, now I'm on a dual monitor setup here. I'm not fancy with 4K monitors, but I got 2K monitors. I frequently will have two windows open side by side, which actually means I'm squeezing them down a little narrower than is maybe intended. But that's my control now. I own that, the way that looks.
Yeah.
Think about that. You have to think about that flexibility.
Yeah. And I would add to that I think an idea when we talk about design philosophies to start with and how we affect change in this space is to start thinking about our designs as things to progressively enhance. One of my favorite websites, I think it's called Hey, It's a Fucking Website. And it's a website that just is rendered in HTML and not much else. And one of the arguments I think on the site is like it's fucking accessible, and it obviously throws a lot of F words in there for comedic effect. But that idea that the internet as it was made is accessible, designers just slowly ruin that as we start to add different features on. Like every website, if you were just to write it in HTML, would be accessible across every browser for every internet speed. Like it's just rendering text, right? But it's the second we start to add like these weighty JavaScript interactions and adding imagery with text baked into it, like that's when we start to get in trouble. So I think when designers start thinking about a design, when content strategists start thinking about the message, start with the most bare minimum thing you can possibly get away with, and only add things if it's actually helping the story. I come from a journalism background, and there is this kind of idea with adding images, which is don't add an image that tells the same story that you've already written. Add an image that tells another component of the story that you can't write about, that can't be written through words. And I think that philosophy can really help with progressive enhancement in only add something if it's really benefiting all the users.
But you're segueing well into the next bullet point I have here, which is talking about imagery.
Yes.
And with images in particular, accessibility focuses I say very heavily. It is a bullet point, a checkbox that we have chosen to take very literally, which is alt text.
Yeah.
Make sure your image has alt text. Make sure your image has alt text. But this idea of also being able to include a long description is something that's often overlooked. Not necessarily a checkbox for the sake of accessibility, but it does allow you to add a lot more information vis-a-vis the image that can be beneficial to other people who are using your site in a different way. And we kind of throw that away. Like, that's not something that's used by very many people at this point. Or if they do, they just copy their alt text into it, which is not the right way to use that field, folks.
Yeah, it's definitely not. And I think that's another component is learn all of your HTML attributes, learn all of your tags. Like, those are your friend. And I think that semantic based
I would second that.
Yeah, semantic based, like writing your site. Why am I having so much trouble with this? Writing your site with the correct semantics goes such a long way. It removes a lot of need for descriptions. Divs are not very specific, right? But like in using header, footer, those types of things are hyper specific, or even article. So I think like that's another thing on going back in terms of learning things, is that I feel like designers just learn divs, and that's like all they need, or developers, designers, whatever, learn divs, and then they learn how to manipulate divs. But there's this whole world of semantic HTML that they just never learn.
And there's a really interesting use case there too, that it greatly enhances accessibility and usability both. That if you are writing good HTML5 articles, navs, headers, footers, those have intrinsic ARIA role values. So if you have, if you have a nav element, you don't have to add an additional ARIA role to that element on top of it. It just will automatically, like, its default value is navigation. And so that actually simplifies a lot of that process. Now, if you're just doing, like you say, div soup, if all you've got are 13 million divs on your page, then you also have to take the time to go through and make sure each one of those has appropriate ARIA roles on them. And if you don't know what ARIA is, we'll leave a link in the show notes about that. It's basically helping to tell screen readers and such what kind of element they're looking at and what its purpose is.
I'm happy to also say that my website now, the smallest font is 16 pixels in the top menu, and the body font is 20. So I'm compliant.
I noticed you were kind of quiet over there, and you're just like slowly trying to make your site more accessible. I love it.
It's fixed.
Solving
sort of.
problems
Yeah.
one show at a time.
Yeah, and I think that going back to ARIA roles, I think that's an interesting, I think of that as almost if you have to use it, you're already one step removed from making the most accessible site you can. That there is this kind of pervasive philosophy across the accessibility community that you shouldn't really have to use those if you're, to your point, using HTML5 properly. That should be more of a crutch.
I've given feedback to design comps that we were sent by outside firms where they would have things like div class equals address or div class equals site. And it's like, why are you doing this and not using the address tag or the site tag? CITE, not SITE.
And that goes back right to just to kind of put a bow on some of these ideas. It's a skill versus smart thing, right? It's the same reason why some developers never got away from making table-based layouts. They had their way of doing things and they've kind of stuck to that, and nobody has sat down and said, hey guys, you need to update.
I think we should maybe revisit that, and I don't think it's a smart thing. I think it's an attitude thing. Because I don't think that this should be people shouldn't, if someone is doing that, if they're a skill-based developer, they shouldn't feel like they're intrinsically flawed or something. It's an attitude that I think ostensibly anyone can go and say like, okay, I don't want to be limited to just this skill set. I would like to expand my horizons and learn these new things, and they can do that. And they don't have to just be limited to just doing table-based layouts.
I think if we solve that particular problem, we've solved a much broader societal issue. I don't think that's web developers. I think that's true for doctors. That's true for gardeners. That's true for contractors and everybody. Like, people get into their rhythm, and it's it's just human nature, I think, to kind of dig in a little bit. But
Drunken UX, solving one society problem at a time.
Our tagline is just going to be solving all the problems. World domination. That's our goal here. So okay. What else can we help people with?
There was so I wanted to mention a couple things that I saw in the Skillshare that I thought were really interesting. One of them was, you mentioned about not using all uppercase text, like as written in the HTML, and because screen readers will read that as an acronym. And I actually had recently, we had on a project at work, we had a table where the table headings, the text was written as all caps, and I went back and I changed it to being properly written with like mixed case, and then I did text transform uppercase, and then that's what you suggested to do. I think it was like, yes, like success, kid. And then the other one was with headings, like not using headings for emphasis, but rather using them to indicate like document structure,
actual outline,
or like hierarchy. Yeah.
People use header structure really arbitrarily. I'm guilty of it, and I think that it's a bad practice that I want to say could have come from CMSs, right? Like people seeing the baked in header stylings and just thinking of them as like, oh, I want this big font here, so I should just use an H1 tag. But like that structure is what helps to dictate like scanning text. Like we take for advantage, those of us who aren't heavily vision impaired, that idea of being able to scan an article or a web page. The way that folks who are vision impaired do that with their screen readers is being able to navigate, say, with their assistive technology, whether it be a keyboard or whatnot, to skip through and maybe read all the header tags. Well, imagine how awful that is when you made all of your inspirational pull quotes in an H3, and that person is just being like subjected to hearing all of these inspirational quotes in H3s, and they're just trying to figure out like, what is the structure of this document? So I think that that's another component that we haven't talked about, is that a lot of times we don't even understand the assistive technologies or ATs that folks are using. So being able to have those in your testing array, in addition to having your MacBook, your iPad, your Surface Pro, whatnot, that you also have those assistive technologies at your disposal and you play with them to understand and to feel how someone is experience this. Like I remember on Twitter, someone tweeted like, sure, your name that has 17 emojis in it like looks cute to you, but this is how it sounds to me as someone who's using a screen reader. And the person recorded it out, and they were reading a thread back and forth between two users, and it was like so much of their time was being wasted hearing like purple heart emoji, red heart emoji, yellow heart emoji, orange heart emoji. And imagine that for like a 30 strand thread on Twitter. Like it's absolutely like just frustrating. So I think bringing those technologies into our testing arenas and making sure we're using them to test so that we can gain like a little bit of understanding of what folks are dealing with.
And if you or your company or whoever you're working with is concerned about the cost of, getting screen reader software and things like this, in your test suite, just remind them that the cost of an accessibility lawsuit is considerably higher. I mean, it's, it's.
Oh, I was just going to say, and to spin that in the positive, right? Like an aspect of my course is selling accessibility and making people understand why it matters. I mean, there's the human component, and I would hope that would cover most people. But then there's also the very business-minded folks who maybe don't care as much about the human component. And for them, it's revenue lost. Mm-hmm. These are people like, I'm a big form field. I have a lot of opinions about form fields. Mm-hmm. So thinking about form fields, that's one of the key metrics to conversion for a lot of businesses. You are losing out on not just people, and I say just lightly and somewhat facetiously, with accessibility concerns. If you have a broken form, you're losing out on a much broader share than that 15%. So I think convincing and illustrating to your key stakeholders who do hold the purse strings to buy you assistive technologies, who do have the purse strings to add the marginally extra hours you need to consider accessibility, they are losing out on revenue if they don't consider accessibility. So that's a way that I paint it for, the big corporations of the world.
A really easy way to check that without even using a screen reader is if you, I know Firefox has this, or it did. I don't know if Chrome does, but in Firefox, you could go to the view menu and then choose page style and then choose no page style. And then it would render whatever mm-hmm. page you're looking at with the CSS disabled. And then you can really see, like, what does this document look like when there's no, like, when the presentation is completely raw. And mm-hmm. A lot of things become immediately apparent. And if you just imagine a screen reader is going to start at the top and work its way down, how far does that screen reader have to go before it gets to any of the navigation? Or, like, if you're looking at it, can you kind of clearly tell what the different parts of the page are without any styling or anything?
And we haven't talked about it at all in this episode yet, but I think maybe it is a great topic for a future, deeper episode. But Firefox has an accessibility inspector built into it now. And it gives you a look at the way the DOM is being rendered from that level. So when a screen reader hits the page and, understanding how it's going to read things and what it's seeing, particularly in the scope of if anything changes on your page. If you've got anything that updates or, swaps out content or things like that, it's designed to give you that feedback. Cool. It's a technical tool because it's not, it's showing you information. It's not, rendering something for you in the same way, but it does give you a lot of information as to how your page looks to a machine. And so that's something to consider. And that, like I say, that may be worth a much deeper dive, I think, down the road.
Yeah, and I'm a huge fan of Firefox Nightly for that reason, and also for its assistance with CSS Grid, which is, I think, a methodology that is worth mentioning, that even when it degrades in the less enhanced browsers that we all know what they are, it still is accessible. And I think that's a core thing, is that with CSS Grid, I'm not saying it's impossible to make an inaccessible site with CSS Grid, because that's certainly not the case, but it is much more inherently accessible.
Firefox is doing a lot to try and endear itself, I think, back to the development community. It used to be, the sweetheart, and then Chrome came along and kind of ate its lunch. But here lately, there's definitely a fight. They're clawing their way back and doing so well, because not just the accessibility inspector, but, like their CSS animation debugger and things like that are all they're super cool.
When you say CSS Grid, are you referring to the CSS Grid layout on Mozilla? Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to put a link to that in the doobly-doo.
Yeah, so CSS Grid, and I think I've had so many conversations with developers of a certain breed who argue with me as to what CSS Grid is. when they're like, "Oh, you mean Flexbox?" and I'm like, "No, it's different." though. It is different for all of those of you who are rolling your eyes saying, does she just mean Flexbox?
So,
no, I don't.
Before we take off for the day, I want to kind of drill into a story a little bit for those of you who are concerned. If you're in a position where any accessibility work, inclusivity work that you want to do is going to be after the fact, that's okay. It's better than not doing that work. And I'm here to tell you that it can be done. We had a redesign project some time back where same kind of thing that to what Aaron was kind of describing. We had a third-party firm come in and give us a layout. We immediately looked at it and said, okay, it's pretty, but there are certainly a number of issues here that we have to raise. We had people who make much more money than us tell us that that's the design. You need to implement that design. And so the way that we fixed this was as a team. We have a phenomenal QA tester that was on our team, and we went to him and said, do you know accessibility? And he says, yes. We say, great. And so we started making it part of his day. He would spend some time just going around the site, and he would find accessibility problems, and he would make a ticket for us. And we would log that ticket, and every week when we did sprint planning, we would make sure to bring up 2 or 3 accessibility tickets. It did mean all of this work was getting done after the fact. No question, that's not the most efficient way to go about it, but it did allow us to start addressing some of these needs, and it got all of our team thinking about it. And I think that's the other, inclusive design, it means one thing to the user, and I think it means another thing to the developers and designers on the ground if you're part of a group. And part of that is making sure you are inclusive internally about the way you're thinking about this, and that you get everybody on board so that somebody isn't kind of dragging behind or not doing their share, and that they understand that this is important. And so we started that process. And then by doing that process, it started to allow us to ask those questions earlier when we were working with marketing, when we were looking at landing page design. Now, all of a sudden, it's something we think about a lot. And so we see white text on a washed out photo, and we're like, hey, has anybody contrast checked that? No? Okay, well, let's do that. Let's get in there and let's make sure that's okay first, and then find a solution to it before we've written any code to support it. And now, as we're not perfect, God knows we still have a long way to go on a lot of our tools. There's still a lot of stuff we build that is very turnkey and just get it done and let's get to the next thing. But we are better now than we were a year ago. And we are better now than we were 6 years ago by light years. And so don't be afraid if this sounds scary, if you don't know how to dig in, if you don't know, what that approach looks like, that you think it's too much to take on. I come back to this this phrase. I think I used it in the last episode too. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time with some teriyaki sauce and a little bit of ginger. That's the way you solve a problem. And that works really well here too, because if you don't start, then you don't get anywhere. That's my lesson.
Tatiana, would you describe the inclusive design or accessible design as being more like a goal that you've reached it? You can say like, okay, we're accessible, this is done, or is it more like kind of an ongoing process that constantly requires reevaluation?
I think it's more of the okay. I think it's more of the latter, and I think going back, something I've personally learned is that we can learn a lot from app releases. I think that we tend to treat, especially with websites, the sprint to a finish. We treat websites a bit like newspapers, right? Like that there's a day when the website will launch, and then we can all breathe again. And then the website tends to kind of live somewhat statically. Maybe we add content to it here and there. But for the most part, I would say most of the websites I've seen live statically. And that sprint to the finish burned everyone out who was working on it. But I think that if we treated websites a bit more like apps and release the first round and release that idea of perfection, And then we could go back and realize that there were components that we wanted to make more accessible. It takes a bit of that pressure off to check the box. And I think that's the thing, is that the inclination to check the box only exists because we think there is a finish line to cross. If we never set ourselves a finish line and instead we say, okay, we've crossed this milestone and we've completed this set of considerations, that still gives you the sense of accomplishment, but decoupling that from the idea of finishing, I think is super critical, especially accessibility. And then I also talk a lot about, within accessibility, releasing the idea of perfection. That, like, I think that we have this tendency, as we do in conversations about, social inclusivity and accessible design, this idea of doing it perfectly the first time, that we're so fearful of making a site that's quote unquote inaccessible that we just end up making a site that's inaccessible. And I think that we need to worry less about making it perfect, and just, like I started this episode with, releasing that idea of mistakes. We are going to make mistakes. We are going to learn that there's a better way to do it. But if we keep releasing improvements, like, we're making the experience better and better with each release. And that's, I think, at the end of the day, all we can really ask for.
Yeah, it's not a failure to realize that you could have done something better. The failure is to not do it better then. You're always going to find that. You're always going to see, oh, this text is too small, or this image is not contrasty enough. Fix it. That's all. It is not a big deal. It is not something to look at as you didn't do good enough or anything like that. It is a process.
I literally fixed it during this recording on my website.
So here is the literal perfect example.
It takes that long.
We identified something, we addressed it, and as a result, it is now better, and it's now good moving forward. Tatiana, I want to thank you for coming on. It has been so good to have you here to talk about this and to go over things. This
has been great.
Before we take off, I want to give you just a couple minutes. Go nuts. Tell everybody where they can find you, what you got coming up, what you want them to know, anything at all. The floor is yours.
Okay, well, the first thing I want to do is acknowledge that, despite trying to call it out and acknowledging it, that I didn't do a very good job covering non-physical disabilities when we were talking about the header tags. Another consideration I want to plant in folks' minds is that folks who are autistic or have ADHD are really affected by the header tag order as well, because they use that to help them process information. So I acknowledge my own blind spots here within this podcast, even of having a bias to physical disability. So I just want to throw that out there.
I was thinking about dyslexia earlier. Actually, I've got a friend who has to use two-factor authentication and has a real hard time with that. And I meant to bring that up too, and I didn't even think about it, but that's another good example. Yeah,
that's a great example. So where you can find me, obviously we referenced my Skillshare course quite a bit, and you do get 2 free months if you sign up through the link that'll be included in this podcast. There's a whole host of excellent classes out there from lots of teachers, and I would highly recommend signing up. I'm also very active on Twitter at Tatiana T. Mac. I talk a lot, not only about accessible and inclusive design, but I talk a lot about race. And I think that a lot of these philosophies that we talked about within accessible and inclusive design, and the mentality and attitude that we take towards this applies for race and gender and socioeconomic class and whatnot as well. So I think the more we can have these types of conversations, the better off we'll all be. And then if you want to see my work on my work in progress website, it's tatianatmac.com. So if anyone's going to, I don't know if this episode will air by the time, but I am headed to Epicurrence, which I'm really excited about, and we'll be talking about similar topics there. So yeah, I'm around.
Thank you.
And if anyone ever has questions, I'm by no means like the accessibility expert, but I'm an excellent Googler, and I have a strong network of accessibility experts at my disposal. So I'm always happy to answer questions for folks without very much judgment.
The Drunken UX Podcast is brought to you by our friends at NewCloud. NewCloud is an industry-leading interactive map provider who has been building location-based solutions for organizations for a decade. Are you trying to find a simple solution to provide your users with an interactive map of your school, city, or business? Well, NewCloud's interactive map platform gives you the power to make and edit a custom interactive map in just minutes. They have a team of professional cartographers who specialize in map illustrations of many different styles and are ready to design an artistic rendering to fit your exact needs. One map serves all of your users' devices with responsive maps that are designed to scale and blend in seamlessly with your existing website. To request a demonstration or to view their portfolio, visit them online at nucloud.com/drunkenux. That's nucloud.com/drunkenux.
Well, thanks again for listening this evening or afternoon or whatever time you're listening to it. This has been really awesome. I learned a lot, and I fixed my website. Thanks again to Tatiana for joining us today. And be sure to check out and connect with us also at Drunken UX on Twitter and Facebook.com/DrunkenUX. And also come chat with us on Slack at drunkenux.com/Slack to sign up. There are a ton of awesome links in the doobly-doo/show notes, including many of the ones we discussed in this podcast and all the ones that Tatiana told us about too. Please check.
Yeah, you can find us online at drunkenux.com. All the show notes will be up there for that. For past episodes, be sure to check out Build Process. We will have a new episode of Build Process coming up in September. Note, run by our blog for the updated schedule on the release dates for that every Wednesday. Otherwise, we have real-time overview. We will look at news articles and tutorials and advice and all of those things for everybody. It takes 10 minutes, and we try to run through as many articles as we can there. Tatiana, again, I can't thank you enough for taking your time out of your day to sit down and go over this with us. We hope you all learned something. If you have any questions, by all means, reach out to us, reach out to her, reach out to Twitter, reach out to somebody. Just don't touch them without consent. And I guess with that, I only have one other thing to say, and that is to keep your personas close and your users closer.
To be